Christmas morning. It all started with the John Doe. He had come in by ambulance at about midnight on Christmas Eve after being found in an alley by a patrolman. He got there before I did, and sat there for most of the day just taking up a slab. I remember feeling sorry for the corpse. Was there someone out there wondering where he was and why he had never come home? The police were baffled, and no one was really sure who he was or how he died. Poison was suspected, but the coroner wasn't in that day, and we were really just minding the shop until he came back on the 26th. I was mostly just trying to make it till 6 p.m. so that I could sign off to the night receptionist and head home. It was Christmas Eve, and I really wanted to get home, put my PJs on, and enjoy my evening. We only had one visitor that day, and he was easily the strangest person I'd ever seen. He came bustling in around noon, a middle-aged guy in dark clothes and an honest-God traveling cloak. When I saw him, I thought to myself that there must be some kind of Harry Potter thing going on in town. The guy looked like an extra in one of the movies, and not one of the extras you want to get to know. The guy just screamed, "Death Eater," at the top of his lungs, and when he saw me, he made a beeline for the desk as he flashed his best shark's grin. The eyes that hung above that smile, however, were the most intense eyes I had ever seen. They looked like pools of green that danced like a lake full of ice. A lake that held monsters beneath the surface. "Excuse me, Mississippi. I'm wondering if you've had any John Does come in today." I told him I'd be happy to take a look and asked him if he could tell me anything about the body he was looking for. "Oh, late 30s, dark hair, probably dressed in jeans and a plaid shirt." I was instantly suspicious because it sounded like he was describing the body I had been wondering about all day. I asked for ID and proof of his relationship to the deceased, but he seemed unable to produce either. He said his brother hadn't come home last night, and someone had told him about the police taking a body that had been found near their apartment, which had brought him here to check on it. I hope it's not him, but I just can't stand to see our poor mother worry over him. The unfaltering grin he wore made me believe otherwise, but I told him that without proof of relation to the deceased, he couldn't view the body. I advised that he come back with a photo ID and identification for the body, perhaps a police report, and then we could do a proper ID on the John Doe. He smiled the whole time, but I didn't really trust that grin. He had expected to just waltz in and do whatever he meant to do, probably snap some pictures for a local tabloid or something, while the morgue was short-staffed for the holidays, but I wasn't about to play along. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have come better prepared. I'll go home and see what I can scrounge up." He left, and I figured I'd never see him again. I wish that had been the case. The strange man came in around noon, but as I settled in to kill the second half of my day, something pinged on my camera around back. The morgue in our town isn't huge. A dozen pull drawers, of which about half are usually occupied. A freezer for long-term storage that holds about 3 or 4 cadavers at any given time, and 3 autopsy tables. Most of our business comes in through the rear, ambulances or hearse from the local funeral homes, and the back door camera has a motion sensor so I can tell when one of them pulls up to pick up or drop off. I wheeled over to the little CCTV monitor near the end of my desk and pushed the silence button as I checked the feed. I had expected to find an ambulance with another drop-off, but instead, I was greeted by an empty alley on the grainy monitor. The cameras were old, the feed full of snow and off-color pictures, but with daylight still holding sway, it was easy to see that nothing was out back but the dumpster we used for garbage. I figured it must have been a bird or something, and went back to playing on my phone. When it chirped again, I glanced over just in time to see a shadow step out of frame. A shadow with a cape or maybe a long cloak. I leaned in and looked at the grainy feed, trying to see where the shadow had gone, but there was nothing. Whatever had set the camera off had stepped out of sight, and I wondered if it might be a bum or something. We did occasionally get vagrants in the alley, but most of them weren't in a big hurry to hang out around the morgue. Most of them knew that lingering in the pull-in lane would get you yelled at by emergency services, and the rest were just afraid of what they might catch from the dumpster, since it was clearly where we disposed of the spare bodies. Har har. Seeing the shadow, however, made me think about our mysterious visitor, and I clicked around on the camera to the other 4 views we had. The cold room was clear. The autopsy room was clear. The back hall was clear. The front room was clear except for me. The movement sensor went off again then, scaring the tar out of me, and when I flipped over to the back alley, I saw an ambulance pulling into the narrow alley. I sighed, getting up as I went to lock the front door and open the back door for them. I hate it when they don't call first, but that's the nature of the business. Ralph was there, the guy who usually drives the bus from St. Michael's with a couple of car crash victims who had died en route to the hospital. They said the families will be by the pick the bodies up tomorrow. What a Christmas. Huh? Sign here. I signed off on his clipboard and the EMTs loaded the bodies into the freezer drawers in the autopsy room. They were pretty banged up, but I had little doubt that whatever mortuary they sent them to would put them back together in time for the funeral. It would either be Gladys or McMahon's if they were locals, and both did excellent work for the price tag. I stuck around to chit-chat with Ralph for a few minutes as he smoked, and as the ambulance rolled out of the alley, I remembered the mysterious shadow and had a look around to see if something was still hanging around. The alley was empty, other than the dumpster and the trash cans, and there was nothing that could have made the shadow in the first place. I headed back inside, having killed an hour at least watching them unload a couple of stiffs, and returned to find a surprise. 2 missed calls and a voicemail from a number I wasn't familiar with. The voicemail turned out to be from someone named Candace, and she sounded scared despite the upbeat holiday music playing in the background. I called her back, and she asked me to wait a moment as she stepped outside. Yes, hi. My name is Candace Gouet-Zaman. My fiancé never came home last night and she sobbed audibly before regaining her composure. I was wondering if maybe you'd had a John Doe come in recently. I told her we had, telling her about the man who'd been brought in last night, and I heard her make a heart-wrenching sound as I described him. She said it might be a few days before she could come and identify the body, something about needing someone to watch her children, and asked if we could please hold the body until she could come and have a look. I explained to her that the coroner wouldn't be back until the 26th, and the body would likely go into long-term storage after tonight anyway. She said she would be there on the 26th when we opened, and thanked me for being so understanding. This is just going to devastate the kids if it's him. They really love Terry so much, especially after the hell their real father put them through. She hung up, and I remember hoping maybe it wasn't him. Nobody wants to find out their new stepdad is dead on Christmas. For the rest of the day, I kept catching strange blips on the camera. I would look up from my phone and see odd movements on the hallway cams or quick and agitated motions from the back area cameras. It was like a moth, or something was catching the lens, and more than once I thought about going to have a look. It was like being the night guard on a Five Nights at Freddy's game, and the parallels were beginning to spook me as the day progressed slowly. At 4, after glancing up half a dozen times to find nothing, I finally went and searched the back for whatever was making the cameras wig out. The back hallway was clear, the emergency lights casting the linoleum in a sickly green color. The back door was locked, the shadows gathering in the back alley as I looked through the back window. The cold storage door was locked, but I opened it anyway and took a peek inside, finding nothing but closed drawers and a lot of condensation. My last stop was the short stay room, and I found the door still locked as I opened it to take a peek. All the drawers were pushed in, all the tables were still clean, and nothing seemed amiss. I didn't find any bugs or wildlife that had gotten in when the back door was open and was forced to return to my desk and wait out the last hour and a half of my shift. 15 minutes later, I looked up and nearly screamed at what I saw on the monitor. The monitor in the autopsy room had detected movement, and I looked up to find a familiar man standing over one of the drawers. The body of our John Doe was lying placidly under his watchful eye, and he reached out to stroke the cheek almost tenderly. I watched as he looked up and into the camera as if he could see me. He grinned, raising his hand to wave at me, and that's when I brought my shaky hand down on the big red button that locked the door between the back room and the front area. I've never had to use it, but I had heard it was installed after some weirdos tried to sneak into the morgue. The maglocks would keep just about anyone without super strength from getting back there, and they would engage the locks on the back door as well. I called the police, and I must have sounded pretty frantic because they came immediately. The guy had finished whatever business he had with the John Doe and moved out of range of the cameras. I hadn't seen him for close to 10 minutes by the time the police got there, and the 3 uniformed officers told me to stay back as they went through the door once I disengaged the button. They told me to re-engage it after they had gone through, and the 15 minutes I stood waiting for them to come back was agonizing. I could just imagine this guy getting the jump on them and somehow getting back out to me. He was weird enough to want to mess around with dead bodies. I shuddered to think what he would do to me and the police officers if given the opportunity. When someone knocked 3 times on the door to the morgue hallway, I jumped and quavered out to ask who was there. "It's Officer Mathers, ma'am. We are ready to come out now." I asked if they had found the man, and they said I must have been seeing things, because there was no one back there. I opened the door after looking through the little window to verify who they were, and all 3 were more than happy to take me through each room and show me that there was no one there. I told them about the man who would come in earlier, the creepy guy who was wondering about the John Doe we had, and they took the description. Despite this, I don't think they took me seriously. They said if I saw him again to give them a call, but that they had found no signs of forced entry, and no signs of anyone having been back there at all. Even the drawer that you reported opened was closed. Nothing disturbed or out of place. Last as far as we could tell, Officer Mathers added. Luckily for me, my relief came in about that time because I don't think I could have stood to be there for another second. I told them what happened, even called my boss to tell them what had happened, and went home to try and relax and enjoy my Christmas Eve. I'd like to say that was the end of it, but the real horror was to come the next day. I was woken up at about 8 o'clock the next morning by a phone call from the police. They were sending a car to come pick me up from my apartment, and they had some questions they needed answered right away. The officer on the phone was being extremely cagey, and if he hadn't started out by giving me his badge number, I would have probably thought it was a crank call. He assured me that it was very serious and that if I didn't agree to come down to the station, I might find myself compelled to do so. So, I got dressed and was indeed picked up by a police car and taken to the local precinct. I was put into a meeting with Detective Ruckers and asked about the nature of my call to the police the day before. I told him the truth. I told him I had seen someone in the morgue area and called the police after locking down the building. Police had come, but they hadn't found anything. I suspected that it was the weirdo who had come in earlier that day, and I gave the detective his description. The detective was very interested in the details of the weird guy I had seen, since now the case of the John Doe had taken a very strange turn. "How could that be?" I asked. "He's been locked in a drawer since they brought him in yesterday." Detective Ruckers gave me a look that told me he was trying not to give me more information than I needed, but before leaving, he finally decided to throw me a bone. "I'm afraid someone took him at some point yesterday and did something pretty terrible with him." I asked him what happened. My curiosity piqued, but he said he couldn't share details of an ongoing investigation with someone who might be involved. "We'll call you if we have any more questions. But I should tell you that you are a person of interest, and probably shouldn't leave town for the next few days." I walked out of the precinct utterly confused. What the hell happened? Turned out I wouldn't have to wait very long for answers. The police were tight-lipped about the incident, but the news was less vague about the details. It appeared that on December 25th at around 4 in the morning, someone had broken into the Guzman home. Mrs. Guzman, the woman I had talked to the day before, had called the police and went to lock herself into her children's bedroom with them. She had no sooner left her bedroom than she heard the screams of her children from the living room. She was afraid that the intruder had done something to them and went charging into the living room to save them. What she found were her children cowering before the Christmas tree, and the body of her fiancé, Terry Russell, sitting in the armchair he had loved so much in life. Police had arrived, but it appeared that no one had forced their way in at all. The police said it looked like Mr. Russell had simply fallen out of the sky into his favorite armchair, just to give his family the worst Christmas surprise of their life. They interviewed Mrs. Guzman, and she told the reporter that her husband had been responsible for these things. It was pretty clear that the police and the reporter had been trying to get her off camera, but Mrs. Guzman was adamant that these facts had to be disseminated. I wondered why they hadn't cut the interview, but I suppose it made the story even more sensational when you thought about it. A distraught fiancée, talking about her vindictive ex-husband after finding the body of her new love in her home on Christmas morning probably boosted their ratings for the whole year. It was Martinez, I know it. He left my Terry there for me to find to remind me not to think I was safe. You have to protect me. Someone has to find him. As long as he's out there, this will never stop. He filled him with presents, like some strange Santa Claus sack. He filled him up after he killed him and left him there for me to find. He left him there. He left him there. He left him there. After that, I had to have answers. We didn't get the body of Terry Russell when it was released by the investigators. They were probably afraid we would lose it again. I never got a chance to look at the report of what had been done to him, but I wasn't without means. A friend of mine, who works for the police department in my town, agreed to have drinks with me. After some pleasantries, he told me all the details that were too gory for TV. He told me how the body had been stuffed with cheap gifts that were wrapped in what appeared to be the divorce papers Mrs. Guzman had sent to her ex-husband. Most of us knew Mrs. Guzman already. We've been called out by the neighbors quite a few times for well checks or domestic violence claims. She never implicated Mr. Guzman, but the bruises we found on her and the kids made it pretty clear that the man had a temper. I asked my friend about Mr. Guzman, about what he looked like and how he seemed to them, and he had a lot more to say about the woman's husband than the woman. The guy was a kook. He always dressed like some kind of wizard with fancy clothes and fancy capes, and always had this look about him. I don't know how to describe it if you've never seen it, but I deal with guys who make a lot of outrageous claims about what they can and can't do. You deal with guys all the time. They tell you they're gonna kill you where you stand, or how they're gonna break both your arms and snap your neck the second you lay a hand on them. Most of those guys are full of crap, but Martinez Guzman was the first guy I believed could actually do it. He wasn't a huge guy, but the look in his eyes made me think he was capable of violence, and that maybe he was capable of other things too. He told me that Martinez Guzman had been nowhere to be found when they arrived, if he had ever been there to start with, but the body of Terry Russell had been seated in the chair just as Mrs. Guzman had said it would be. There was no sign of forced entry, just like it said on the news, and it was like he had just dropped out of the sky right into that chair. We searched the house first, not figuring her finance was going anywhere, but once we got back to the living room, we saw something out of place. There were things on the floor in front of him, things wrapped in paper that was discolored. They just kept falling to the floor as we came back into the living room, and we didn't really understand what they were until we came around the chair. He paused for a moment and took a long pull off his drink. It was one of the worst things I've ever seen. His belly had just opened up as if someone had drawn a zipper, and there were all these little paper packages lying on the ground. They were cheap things, little toys and costume jewelry, and they were all wrapped up in legal papers. We didn't even know they were divorce papers until we got them back to have them analyzed. That was when we started really looking at Martinez. The papers were from a packet his wife's lawyer had mailed to him, and they weren't something just anyone could have gotten a hold of. It was like the son of a bitch had wrapped up all these presents for them to open and then just put them in her fiancé. Then he had turned the man loose to just walk home and deliver them. I asked him how the presents had gotten in there since we hadn't even autopsied the man, and he gave me this strangely mystic look. That's the thing, there were no cuts on him. There were no incisions, no stitches, no staples. There was nothing. It was as if things had just appeared inside of him fully wrapped, and then he had taken them home for delivery. He took another long drink, and when he sat the glass down, he raised his hand at the barkeep to get another one. I've seen some weird shit on the force. You remember that alligator we found in the sewer and those girls that went missing who just randomly appeared in the cornfield last year? But this is beyond even me. I don't understand it, but I believe Mrs. Guzman when she tells me that her husband is some kind of magic man. She talked about it constantly when she was at the station. She talked about how she and her kids needed protection, how they needed to disappear, how they needed to go somewhere Martinez would never find them. She was adamant about it, and most of the guys at the station think she's a nut. Looking at that and remembering the way his eyes looked anytime we would interview him, I don't think she's a nut. I think she got mixed up with something bad, and I think if we don't make her disappear, then we'll find her and those kids dead someday. He finished his drink in one long slurp and then excused himself, saying he needed to get some air. That was a couple of weeks ago, and the media has finally forgotten about the strange present Mrs. Guzman and her children were delivered Christmas morning. They may have, but I haven't. There's nothing I can do about it, except give out the description of Martinez Guzman, and hope that if anyone sees him, they'll know to stay away from him. He's a man in his early 40s, Hispanic, with short dark hair and the most intense emerald green eyes I've ever seen. He was wearing strange clothes, like a costume from a Harry Potter movie, and when he spoke, it felt like spiders running up my spine. I don't recommend that you approach him. I don't recommend that you attempt to apprehend him. For the love of God, I don't recommend that you get to know him at all. As Mrs. Guzman could attest, his presence are far from what's on anyone's Christmas list.